Alrighty, hello every folks, and good morning! Welcome to a new beginner's guide to Tactics Ogre 1 Vision. Probably one of the finest mod projects you will ever see. Now, with that said, there's a lot of kind of different folks that have asked for this guide from all kinds of different backgrounds, from the folks that have never played a Tactics Ogre before, to the Final Fantasy Tactics fans, to the ones that potentially are series long-timers but refuse to ever move on from the PS1 version or something. There's a lot of different backgrounds that we're looking to understand what this mod is. So first of all, before we even get into all of that, when it comes to One Vision, understand that it's not a simple mod. The thing has been basically tweaked and tweaked and tweaked with community feedback and a hell of a lot of love over the course of the better part of a decade, so it has had the time to simmer. So any systems that you see, you can generally accept are going to be doing exactly what they say that they're doing. If there's something that doesn't feel like it's potentially working right, there's a decent chance you're maybe misunderstanding a mechanic. That is something to be expected. There's a ridiculous amount of mechanics in these games, but let's go ahead and get started. So before we get into said mechanics, story, right? So one of the things that Tactics Ogre is known for is being an adaptive narrative. Now, before you ask, no, you don't have to worry about the rest of the series, before getting into this one. Technically speaking, it is listed as the 7th in the series, though the series also started with a 5th entry. So, it's one of these situations where he was trying to do a Star Wars, and then basically ended up starting off in the middle, then kind of sort of leaving the prequels to somebody else, then getting mad at that somebody else, and every single one of these games has a different setting, a different story, and completely different mechanics. So understand that when it comes to the Ogre series, they all take place in the same world, but the mechanics are oftentimes not even kind of related to each other. So let's go ahead and start from there. So you're safe starting here. Generally, it's recommended for folks to start with Tactics Ogre Reborn, just due to kind of generally smoother gameplay and voice acting and stuff like that, and, you know, officially supporting the series in the only way that's actually possible at the moment. Or starting with Knight of Lotus, just because it's a little bit of a simpler one to get into, but this is a perfectly fine place to start. Now, let's start talking mechanics. Before we get into anything else, everything is a mechanic, and everything is part of the world. This whole thing is something of a simulation, so understand that you are living in the simulation. So before we even get into the combat mechanics, understand that it's not only your dialogue choices that actually impact the story, but things like your reputation, things like who lives and dies, hell, even situations where people share information, whether or not they know certain things, whether or not they had a chance to lie to each other about certain things. There's a lot of kind of bits and pieces all over the place, because simply put, you're not really meant to understand your impact in the world. This whole thing is a simulation of kind of two confused siblings trying to survive a generations-long genocide, not a case of trying to have your organized perfect timeline on your very first playthrough. The confusion is intentional by design. However, this mod does a better job than most of the official versions in terms of being clear about the combat mechanics, which is the important part, as well as actually fixing a couple random dialogue bits and pieces, but that's neither here nor there, nor do I specifically remember where those are at this point. So let's go ahead and talk about combat mechanics. So before we get into the pieces and starter builds or any of that, I want to introduce you to some UI elements. Welcome to your best friend, the select button. Anytime you're ever confused about anything, hit your select button and it will give you these little nodes. Not nerds, nodes all over the place, which will give you a bit of additional information. For example, do you want to know if your crossbow is a heavy weapon because you have to pull the string back, or a dexterous weapon because you gotta aim it real good? Well, it turns out it's lightweight. It's a sort of dexterity-based weapon. Strength will still help you, but it is a dexterity-favoring weapon. For example, oftentimes RPGs love to make spears that, for whatever reason, are dexterous. That makes no sense. Spears are heavy as hell. So if we go ahead and mouse over the spear category, we'll see, hey, look, spears are a heavy weapon. This makes sense. Or in other cases, you'll have weapons that are more so mental-based. For example, if you use a spell book, you can have one of your casters throw their spellbook at somebody, and that uses their mental stats as a form of damage. Now, you won't exactly be going and dominating stuff with spellbooks. I mean, technically there are builds that can do that, but you won't generally be doing that. But it is something to know. Or additionally, even something like shields. If you mouse over your shield, you'll find out, hey, shields are in the bash category, and the bash category improves their damage based off how much defense they have. So, for example, a knight using heavy armor would actually do more damage with their heavyweight shield than they would with, like, let's say, their weapon in some cases. Now, with that all being said, everything is also a tool. So the next thing that I want to introduce you to is the square menu. Now this is different in context. In this case, in this particular menu, it will flip through pages. So in order to access this menu, you hold down square, or X, or Y, or whatever it happens to be on your particular controller, and then you hit left and right. Now in this particular menu, it'll flip through information pages. It is always on screen to remind you, but hell, I was probably hundreds of hours into this game before I even realized that UI prompt, so understand that that is what the square menu is talking about. You hold square, you go to the sides, and that'll flip you between your different pages. And for example, in the world map, this will, or not the world map, technically also the world map, but whenever you're out and about, this also allows you to swivel and zoom the camera as well as you'd prefer. Now, with that said, let's talk about what these pages mean so that we can get into builds and understanding how to fight things. So every item will have multiple different pages. Your stat screen will tell you how much it affects your character's stats, as well as a attack and defense value. These can be seen as more kind of hard values, so attack can kind of be seen as penetration, defense can kind of be seen as armor value, but please understand that we are primarily focusing on, is this higher than this other thing, kind of viewing everything as relative, more so than trying to remember exact thresholds, because these numbers are moving around all the time. Alright, this is a formula that I'm pretty sure Rakes understands. He's the guy that made the mod, but all the rest of us, just fly straight over our head here. So it's not really something that you're going to be able to understand the thresholds of in most situations. Just generally speaking, if you have more defensive value, you have more sort of hard armor. If you have better vitality and stuff like that, you'll generally have better like softer armor and as well as health. And if something has a higher attack value, it'll generally be better at penetrating something. And that being said, we also have a wait and recovery time. Wait is how much it costs to actually keep that piece of equipment equipped. So up here on the top right, you have what's known as your recovery time. This is the thing that ticks down to start your next turn. And what you have up here in the top right is going to be your standard value. So for example, right now, this thing has a value of 7, or what was it, 8, I think? Yeah, no, it's 7 weight on this axe right now, and the recovery time is 108. If, for example, we pick up the sword over here, it'll go down very slightly. Now, you don't necessarily need to min-max this, but this is something to generally keep in mind in terms of when you want to make your unit faster or slower. Their equip weight will slow them down, and there is no sanity check as far as whether or not somebody can multi-round somebody. Generally speaking, everyone will still get a turn, and heavier equipment will only slightly slow you down compared to somebody else, but over time, if you have somebody using a lot of skills, which also take recovery time, have heavy equipment, which takes recovery time, and moving a long distance, which also takes recovery time, that's when they start getting multi-rounded and stuff like that. So understand that movement speed is an important factor to your strategy as far as all this stuff is concerned. Another thing to also mention is that usually you do not want to have empty equipment slots. Usually having equipment is far more valuable than having that slight bump in speed. Just so you're aware. There are some units that can get away with it. And actually, one quick pause, because for some reason the dog is barking at the mailman. We dealt with the barking dog, now let's go ahead and continue on. So every class in this game is going to be viable in its own ways. Every class is going to have its own properties, and oftentimes will have features that are not immediately obvious. So with that said, I want to also introduce you to the class menu here. So if you go to your party screen, you hit triangle, and then you hit triangle again. This will take you to the class menu, which will tell you what every class is up to. Now, usually this will just be things like stats and whatever else, but it'll give you an idea. Like, for example, you look at the warrior, okay, their natural stats are leaning a bit more towards attack, and they have a passive attack that allows them to throw a stone. Whereas, let's say we look at the archer, and we see they've got something called blindside and flicker. So this means that as a melee attack, like let's say that you only have a longbow on that unit, but you give them a counter attack, if somebody attacks them in melee range, they'll lean down into the dirt and throw some sand in their face. That's what blindside is. It's essentially a way to blind somebody with sand, hitting them for a small amount of damage, but also inflicting false strike, making their melee attacks less likely to hit. Or let's say somebody like the sorceress is able to use a malediction, which basically allows them to shoot out a free curse at somebody that goes and reduces their magical defense. Or let's say something like the cleric, who is also known as the monk, would be able to go and punch something. A little bit of a side note, by the way, if you wanted to change what these are, or just wanted to see the different gender version, you can just hit X on this menu and it'll show you the next thing. Or let's say we have something special like the Valkyrie here, who's able to throw items. So even though she has, let's say, a pike in both hands, or she has a sword and shield or something along those lines, she's still able to throw items. Now, there's a lot of different classes with a lot of different roles, and understand that they all will be good. So generally the advice that's the best to throw out here is just that everything is viable, use what you think is cool. You don't have to use every class, and classes don't really promote into each other. So usually whenever a class is good from the beginning, and which is going to be basically all of them, they're going to keep getting new tools at the same rate as everybody else. And oftentimes you'll find little tricks that you can go and pick up from either various items or the store or whatever else that allow you to build something out pretty cool. Like on one of my recent playthroughs, I had a basic soldier, and he was just doing the usual sword and board thing, and that was all well and good, but I found that oftentimes he was out of range with his melee weapon from the way that I was using him. Now, this doesn't mean that, you shouldn't use them as melee. A lot of folks use them as their kind of like frontline pusher, as it were. And so I ultimately ended up giving him a shield, a recruit skill, and a javelin, which allowed him to attack from range. He had a shield that was so heavy it prevented him from being knocked backwards, but also guaranteed a stunning hit whenever he rammed somebody with it, and would use javelins to basically go and damage people's feet so they couldn't move as far. And basically all he would do was use this kind of loadout to go and support everybody, but then go in to get close in order to negotiate with enemy soldiers to get them to surrender. So everything is on the table. When you look at your units, understand that there's a lot more on the table than you would typically expect from games like this. So you're not just looking for raw damage and DPS and tanking and healing. You usually will have a bit of a hard time keeping up with healing, and oftentimes if you want your party to be able to sustain their healing abilities, you oftentimes will want to keep them in formation. You'll want units going and supporting each other, taking weight off each other, like you train a knight to use some first aid healing abilities in order to be able to take that weight off of the cleric so that they can focus on healing. But then who's getting rid of the debuffs? Okay, well maybe the Valkyrie can use their item throwing ability to get rid of those debuffs, that sort of thing. Now, this stuff is all stuff that you will just kind of discover over time. Everybody has their own preferences and their own kind of class uses as they carry along. So everyone's team ultimately ends up kind of being a tapestry of the kinds of stuff that they end up preferring. One of the proud things that the community loves to state over and over about this mod is that there is no meta. There is no sort of perfect build, there is no perfect unit to do everything, and anytime there's ever been anything that came close to a perfect build that got rid of that creativity factor, it was quickly squashed with the next patch. Rest in peace, Power Core Golems. But as far as units go, generally this mod is all about problem-solving creativity. So let's talk about how to fight things, because it's what you're going to be doing a good majority of the time. So everything is part of the simulation. So first of all, take a look at this map. Remember what I was saying about that square menu earlier? Hold down square, it'll tell you how much health everybody has. That oftentimes confuses new players. You want to look at something from a different perspective, swivel left and right to make the menu go like this, and then you can zoom in and out if you want to see more or less of everything. Next, let's look at these tiles. On the bottom right, it'll tell you what kind of tile you're standing on, as well as the accuracy bonus that it gives you. For example, standing on gravel makes taking a shot or taking a swing a little bit more difficult. Standing on some nice scrubby grass is going to be some good footing. Standing in the water gives you nothing unless you're an aquatic unit. So bear that in mind. Additionally, the distance that you move adds up to make you slower. So like right now, you'll notice Canopus, this birdman, is over there on the bottom right. His next turn is over there on the bottom right. If he moves one tile, he will move back a little bit in the turn order. If he moves a few tiles, he'll move farther back in the turn order to the point that he's completely out of there, and the farther that he moves, the longer it will take for his next turn to come. This means that oftentimes if you are looking to intercept somebody, if you're looking to fight somebody, you're usually better not charging at them, but for example, taking a couple of tiles forward and getting ready to intercept them in the future. So like right now, I'm just going to move a few tiles forward and try to stay out of range of those enemy units. Next, I'll have my cleric go and look at her equipment, and hey, look at that, she's got a spell book, but if she uses that in her inventory, she's able to read it to give herself some NP. She's able to meditate by sitting down and reading her book. A lot of your weapons will have additional functions like this, and these categories of these different weapons will be consistent. For example, standard casting stabs will let you improve the power of your spells. Stuff like books allow you to sit down and read them. And later on, you'll get all kinds of different tools, like replacing your arm gauntlets with like a grappling gun that allows you to go grapple onto something at a distance. So. So when you're going and flipping through those pages of different pieces of equipment, bear that in mind. Now, in this case, I brought along Voltaire as a new class that I've never used, because this class leveling system is oftentimes something that confuses many new players. Now, I'm going to assume that you followed the guide that I put out there as far as installation goes, in which case you should have at least two cheats active. Now, this is going to look different than your cheat menu more than likely, because I'm playing this off of original hardware. So in this case, we're going to be using the low-level class experience scaling fix. Additionally, we're also using the enemy pickups go to player cheat. Now, the reason that we use these is quality of life. So when it comes to the leveling system, the default system that the game used was a little bit iffy. It resulted in a situation where if you used too many of a particular class, they had a tendency to kind of fly past everybody else's levels. And additionally, when it came to kind of equipment on the ground and stuff, the AI would have the ability to go pick it up and delete it with no way to get it back. Now, both of these are fixed with those particular cheats, and the reason that they're used is because it, functionally speaking, makes it so that you're not really worrying about levels as much as you're worrying about skills, which is how this game should be played. When it comes to levels, they don't actually give you that much of an advantage. In fact, it makes the world scale up against you faster than you actually gain skills. That's the problem. So in this case, your actual power comes from figuring out good equipment combinations, figuring out how to be kind of effective with your skills, and additionally knowing what skills to use when. So like in this case, I'm just going to have him fire his crossbow at a distance and hold still for where he is. This Valkyrie over here has some heavy armor, so she's going to be able to take some decent hits. And I'm just going to have her throw this pike across this river over at this wizard in order to then set up another follow-up attack. So this takes me to another thing that's going to help you out in the early game. Actually, in most of the game, for that matter. So, as I mentioned, everything is part of the simulation. Like right now, it's raining, meaning that everyone's accuracy is absolutely tanking. So if, for example, you ever found yourself in a position that you felt the enemy was hitting you way too hard, you can, for example, use an item called a Savage Bugle to go and make the weather worse in order to make it harder for them to hit you. But in this particular case, you'll notice that our accuracy is like 50 to 75%, possibly lower on some of our slower units. That's not terribly reliable, but we're not going to sit here being frustrated over the fact that we couldn't hit them. For example, Canopus's accuracy is not amazing, but one of the abilities that I gave to the Valkyrie over here is called Fated Circle. And this is the first of many guarantee abilities. There's a lot of different flavors of these, but what guarantee abilities are something that allows the next attack from that unit to be guaranteed if it's a particular type. So for example, Fated Circle will be a small circle in which every melee attack from those units will definitely hit unless it's parried. All it says, it'll hit the other person. If the other person parries, I mean, technically it hit their weapon. but just understand that it just guarantees the attack. But the kind of side benefit of this is that it also guarantees any secondary effects. So like Mr. Canopus over here is carrying around a Warhammer, whose effect is that it can stun. Now, typically, these odds are like 25-30% for a heavy weapon, about 15-20-ish% for a lighter weapon, depending. So they're not going to happen all the time. They sometimes happen, but if your attack is guaranteed, well, guess what? That stun is definitely coming your way. Which then takes me to another angle. You notice how that unit was about to counter and all of a sudden didn't? That's because in that particular instance, when he went and took that swing, it hit her with a stun, and if a unit is stunned, it prevents counterattacks. So there's a lot of debuffs in this game. A lot of debuffs with a lot of different little kind of quirks to learn and whatnot, but right from the get-go, stun is probably going to be one of your immediate favorites. It prevents units from acting 50% of the time, it prevents them from countering, and it's generally pretty easy to go and land on somebody. But in this case, they got lucky, and they ended up stabbing the leg of our Valkyrie over there, who can no longer move. Now, she's got other options, so it's fine, but it is something to kind of bear in mind for the time being. So we'll just go ahead and throw out some spells and continue on. Now, notice when she hit with that spell, we actually noticed a different type of debuff suddenly came up. That is averse. So what does averse mean? So averse means that their defense against a particular element goes down. Now, there's a lot of ways that this can happen, typically with spells. Like, you'll notice your starting party has Kashua, who casts light spells and inflicts light averse, or dark averse rather, whereas the caster that you start with casts dark spells that inflict light averse, meaning that if you have two opposing element wizards, they can kind of stack up each other's damage against a particular target. They can sort of tag team and pincer something at long range. But there's other sources of those elements as well, like later on you'll have elemental weapons, and whenever you have sufficient skills in a particular weapon type, you will learn what's known as a finisher, and every single one of those has an element. So, let's say you go and you learn that finisher, you then put on a missile spell with the opposing element. All of a sudden, you can improve the damage of one of these powerful skills by hitting them with a spell beforehand. There's a lot of ways to do this. Again, we're just kind of skimming over the surface here, but Mr. Canopus here is a good example. He hasn't learned his first finisher yet, because he's only 50% of the way towards getting it. But the first finisher that hammers get, for example, is Ice, and one of the first spells that you get right out of the tutorial is a Fireball spell. So I would recommend switching Canopus over to hammers, teaching him that Fireball spell, and looking how good that combination is for yourself, because it is a solid way to go and potentially dang near one-shot something if you choose to. Alright, next thing that you should know is that there are a lot of different spell types in the game. Now, a lot of them are going to be a bit more specific, like let's say something like Cleanse has an absolute ton of range, but it only clears Poison, Wither, and Curse. Something like Innervate has plenty of range again, but it has only its Stun, Silence, and Petrify that it'll cure. However, you have another spell here in the form of Dispel. It is a shorter range, costs a little bit more, and it will get rid of one of anything. So if somebody's only affected by one debuff, this is one of those spells that you really want to keep in mind. A lot of classes can learn it, and it's something that's relatively cheap. So it's a nice little kind of thing to know. Next on the pile, in terms of kind of guaranteed things, we have not quite a guarantee, but the next best thing, and this is going to be Trajectory. Now, this is a skill that your archer will start with, and something that you should put on everybody as soon as you possibly can. Like right now, Canopus can learn it, the Rogue and Ninja can learn it, our basic soldiers can learn it. Just about everybody can actually learn this thing, or something similar for the most part. Something like a Berserker, for example, can't, but they can attack in an AoE. Somebody like the Cleric/Monk has better things to do. Something like the Valkyrie has Fated Circle, which costs more, but it's arguably a bit better. Terror Knight has something like Terrifying Impact. But the reason that we actually use this skill is to improve our accuracy a little bit. Actually, let's go ahead and reset that so I can show you. So like, let's say she was taking a shot on this guy, and due to the rain, I mean, this is going down to 55%. This is not helping us, but notice he's facing to the left. We are currently to his side. Facing is important, and so in this case what we're going to do is we're going to turn on Trajectory. So what it does is that it causes the next attack to count as if it's hitting from the back. Now this works whether it's a melee attack, a ranged attack, a spell, anything. That's one of the things that makes it so universally good, and so now our accuracy is up to 70%. It's still not guaranteed. We've lost those kinds of odds in this fight before, but understand that this is a game not about getting perfect optimization for every one of your units, but having backup plans for when your situation is a bit more compromised. Like right here, everybody's blocking their attacks all the dang time, but simply by having these skills on hand, we might be able to get a little bit farther. In this case, due to good footing, due to the fact that this is a very fast unit attacking a very slow unit, he's able to do pretty good against this Berserker, and he doesn't necessarily need to use it. But we have other skills that can improve this in another direction. For example, we have Squash over here. And we could, for example, use Squash to have a chance to stagger this unit, making him more likely to be hit. On the other end, let's say we could use it over here to then go and dismantle this boulder, because this thing is in our way for whatever reason. So there's a lot of skills that will be like that, that allow you to kind of impact the world around you, or potentially impact units around you in different ways. So just remember to read those descriptions. Reading is going to be a pretty darn important thing wherever you are. Also, this guy's not very dodgy, so we're not going to worry about ruining his movement, and we'll just go ahead and move on. So in this case, we see we've got a pretty decent shot over here of taking out this caster, so we'll just go ahead and hit her with this pike. And that gets us next to our weapon categories. Now, there's a lot of categories to cover. Right from the get-go, you have a bit over a dozen different varieties of different weapons to go and try out with. And know that over time, you will be getting more and more added to these categories as time goes on. The standard stuff will always be standard. So, for example, your standard robes, lightweight armor, as well as heavy armor, will always have the exact same weight, and will always generally tend towards the same things. For example, lightweight robes and stuff like that are not going to be very good against things like arrows or spears, but they are going to be at least somewhat resistant to crushing and crushing and slashing attacks. Even if it's generally the lowest of the bunch, at least they can resist it a little bit. But they are very good at warding away spells. You'll notice we haven't really shot many spells at spellcasters. This is why. Let's say we have lightweight armor, like this guy's got right here, and so in this case, it's going to be good at voiding things, it's going to be sort of medium in its weight, and it's going to be decent against crushing and piercing attacks, but it's got a somewhat weakness against slashing attacks, which normally isn't something you would necessarily pay much attention to, but it does mean that, for example, swords are pretty good against light armor units. They're a high accuracy slashing weapon that happens to counter most of what a vest does. Or let's say a heavy armor unit, like let's say this one over here, is going to have great slashing and piercing defenses, but they're going to have a weakness against some crushing things. So, crushing types of spells, or let's say heavy warhammers or stuff like that. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily weak. Like if we, let's say, compare the weaknesses here, we'll notice that the strongest of this thing is only 17, whereas this thing's weakest is 15. Like, it's still very durable. Heavy armor is generally going to be pretty difficult to get through, but it does mean certain things are generally better against that armor. This is what I mean about you don't necessarily have to worry about understanding the exact numbers. Just think about it logically. What did people used to use when they were looking to get past a knight's defenses? Well, they would either disable them in some way, like, for example, using a guaranteed attack with your dagger to break their leg to leave them pinned, hit them with some poison, and walk away. Or let's say they would use a heavy warhammer, or some kind of a poleaxe or something like that to try to break around it, break limbs or whatnot. And so we have hammers for stunning things. We have warhammers for trying to get past their defenses. We've got pikes and stuff like that for potentially getting through heavy swords and axes and things. There's a lot of different options. So just trying to think about it logically, and you'll start picking it up pretty quickly. Now, in many ways, the easiest way to think about this game is, like, if you want to really get ahead, think about the least that you can do to get your goal done. Like right here, in this particular instance, what I was talking about trajectory earlier, I could fly to her back in order to make that attack happen, or I could save that movement and just try to attack her from the front with the same odds because of trajectory. That skill is very, very useful. Now, it's not really going to be something that you always want to use in every situation. It is still a cost that you're accumulating over time, but it does allow for a lot more consistency in the early game. Then again, you also have other abilities that will have other properties. So like the Mighty Strike on your warriors or the Tremendous Shot on your archers will be a guaranteed critical, which also means that it knocks the target backwards. So like in this case, we knock them backwards and we break their leg. That's very useful on this dagger. and let's say I gave him a counter-attacking ability, which I haven't been able to afford on him yet, he would then, let's say, get hit by an attack, hopefully dodge it, break the guy's legs as they're being thrown backwards out of attack range. So try to think about little synergies like that, and remember to always try to have your people work together. Teamwork is always going to be a lot more useful than trying to make one unit specifically overpowered, because it's going to take a very, 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 very long time to actually try and make somebody overpowered. I mean, you'd basically have to recruit untold dozens of different monsters, sell them at a loss to the shop, go spend egregious amounts of money to go buy stat items, and even then they will be very slightly better, maybe. And they may still get outplayed or put in a bad situation or whatever else. So it's teamwork, it's builds, it's understanding your tools and utilizing them effectively that's really going to get you ahead here. Okay? So okay, just to kind of cover a few little bits and pieces that we haven't really used this particular fight, next let's talk about recruiting. So, on paper, this for folks that are a bit more familiar maybe with SRPGs, you might be used to seeing recruitment as a way to just sort of do the Pokemon thing of getting your kind of units that you particularly like. It's like, hey, that guy's pretty cool, I want him on my team, and so you go and recruit somebody and, you know, they're on your team now. Nifty. Now, in this particular game, recruit is something that you should be doing all the time. It's a very, very potent offensive tool because it not only subdues an enemy, basically finishing them without taking your primary action, seeing as it is listed in the skills category, it's something that you can just sort of do in the middle of your turn. But it not only finishes them off, it also causes them to join you permanently. So over the course of that fight, you'll be able to actually in this case, I think we're actually going to fly behind her because I want him to regenerate a little bit. So over the, like, let's say you go and you cause them to join your team, and they have now permanently joined you. They also join you temporarily. Worst case scenario, they take a hit for you, and you've basically just potentially, you know, lost this new unit that you've gained. But they also could mean a lot of other things. They might stick with you the whole rest of that fight and be a very useful asset. They might potentially be sacrificed in order to get one of your units back. Because while the AI loses their units immediately if one of your units is downed, they have to be revived. But the revive system in OneVision is a bit unusual, in that you actually have to sacrifice somebody. Big air quotes on that one, but you have to basically bench somebody in order to get them back. So like when you use a lifeline gem, it says it drains all energy from the user, forcing them to flee. So they warp out of the fight, but they get the downed unit back on their feet. And so this means that it gives you a sort of temporary benefit for a longer term downside over the course of that fight. It prevents them from bleeding out, but they are coming into the fight and in an injured state. You've lost a potentially healthy unit, but there's so many little things swirling around that particular decision. Because let's say you have a very heavily injured unit. Okay, you're pretty good potentially going and sacrificing them entirely for the purpose of getting somebody that is a bit more useful back on their feet. Like they've got like 20 debuffs on them, what are you going to do? Or in other cases, maybe somebody's just got a cool piece of equipment and you recruit them just to steal that piece of equipment. Because if anybody joins you, all of their equipment comes with them. They will come with all of their stuff that they had on them. Also, just to show how good these guarantees are, they absolutely do not care about what the odds were originally. This is now 100%. Very, very useful ability here. I think Valkyrie still remains one of my favorite units overall. But anyways, the point is, it gives you a lot of potential questions to ask yourself in terms of what might be useful, what might not be useful, but there's really nothing but benefits to using recruitment. Additionally, those recruitment skills are part of several skills that will actually train themselves up as you use them. So we'll get into those in a moment. I want to cover a few more bits and pieces here before we kind of properly finish off this map and such. Specifically, I want to see somebody get recruited. But when you're going and training your skills, everybody's got several different skills that they might potentially be training up. And so let's say we've got somebody using their weapon skills every time that they go and they train with a weapon. You've got units that will potentially be training with their recruitment skills every time they try to recruit somebody. And if, say, they are particularly racist against somebody, they train their racial skills, which is kind of messed up, but, I mean, in the setting, it certainly makes sense, I suppose. Now, with that said, here, let me go ahead and double check one thing. I forget if archers are semi-aquatic, but if they are, we are about to go throw her in the water just for maximum, you definitely want to join us right now points. But let's go ahead and slap her into the water here just to make sure that in case our movement is affected on my knight over there, he will still be able to get close and negotiate. So the lower somebody's health is, the higher your training in recruitment, the higher your rank of anatomy, which is your ability to understand people, the higher your odds of recruiting somebody. Essentially going against their loyalty. So like this random unit in the middle of nowhere, she absolutely does not care who she's fighting for. She's happy joining you because, hey, you know what? Like, look, it's pretty awful being out here in the sticks, getting rained on and beaten to death while drowning in a river. Sure, I'll come work for you. You want to give me a job? That's way better than death. So, oftentimes what I personally will use is what I like to call the cake or death approach, in which you go up and you attack somebody, and let's say they have low health, you go for the recruit. If it happens, great. If not, finish them off with a shield. Because shields are one of your very, very, I would say, more generally useful guaranteed attacks that I probably should have mentioned up to this point, because shields almost never miss. Their secondary effects, especially on the heavier shields, are also very likely to happen. So the knockback effect will always happen. The stun effect on like a heavy tower shield will always happen. But something more lightweight, like a lightweight shield that, for example, has a silencing effect, so they're like jabbing somebody in the throat with the thing, that's a bit more tricky to pull off and not really going to work every time. Now, next thing I want to bring up here is the experience scaling fix. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you see its effect right here. So everybody in the team was level 6, and I had a brand new unit that was at level 1. Due to the experience scaling fix, this new unit ate all of the experience, and they are now caught up to the rest of the team. This means that if you ever have one unit there, the fastest way that you could ever possibly rank everything up is to have several low-level units and one higher-level unit, and then all of those lower level units that are using the same class would just gobble up all of the experience. But this is a great kind of second, in which you take your new guy, you throw them in the back, you have them do whatever for a little bit, and they will very, very, very quickly catch up to everybody else. You really should not be grinding in most situations. You can do it if there's specific builds you want to go for, but realistically, just kind of roleplay is really what you want to be doing here. All right, which actually gets me to another thing that I want to cover real quick. So you remember those questions at the very start? I'm assuming you've already started the game. Most of the time when folks are looking at a guide, they've already started it and gotten stuck around the middle of Chapter 2 or something. But specifically in this case, I want to mention that the questions at the very start actually impact Denim's stats. So if you are at the very beginning, if you were trying to do a particular thing, you can actually figure out, like, let's say you weren't happy with how your denim turned out. One of the things that you can do is, let's say, pick all the options on the left to go for a strength build, pick all the ones in the middle to go for a speedy build, and pick all the ones on the right to go for a caster build. Honestly, in most situations, I would just recommend you go in and roleplay, but I'm just kind of throwing that out there. So there's that. Aside from that, just understand that every skill is potentially useful and has upsides and downsides. Like, let's say you have a wizard that's got a lot of rogue-type stats, this is still perfectly fine because maybe they'll dodge attacks more often. Let's say you've got a more kind of a resilient spellcasty sort, right? Apparently I have none of those in the team right now. Well, I guess kinda, sorta, Voltaire, whatever, it'll work. So, like, let's say they're leaning more towards the sort of mental side of things in terms of having high intelligence, mind, and resistance, or what have you. In fact, actually, we'll probably go to the store and find one like that to show you what I mean, because usually it'll pair those skills up together. Here, let's see if we can find somebody like that. Yeah, like this guy. You'll see his intelligence, mind, and res are all higher than his other stats. And let's say you intended to make him a berserker. That's still perfectly fine because that high mind and resistance pair up together to cover one of the weaknesses of that berserker. So understand that every stat has upsides and downsides. You're not looking for particular thresholds. Just like you look at that guy as like, oh, he's kind of more mentally orientated. Okay, this could cover a weakness. This could be good for casting. You know, maybe we make him a guy that's kind of a hybrid. He sometimes does spells, but he also plinks things. Maybe we give him a debuff weapon because he's not really doing much damage anyway, but if he can disable something and maybe just move quickly, you know, that might be what we're looking for. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of kind of back and forth like that. And yeah, you can tweak around your classes however you'd like, and just get creative with it. Experiment around with things. In this particular case, the only reason that I actually had a staff on this dude over here is because I didn't have a hammer, or rather an axe, for him to use yet. So we'll just go ahead and buy him his axe real quick. Get a heavy axe, because Terror Knights only use heavy axes. It's just what they prefer. It's just what they've always done throughout the series. Okay, a couple of other little notes to go and bring up here in terms of equipment and stuff like that. Generally, it's advised to avoid going out of your way to buy equipment, because in most cases you'll just get equipment, and this is also true later on with the side graded equipment. Like usually, let's say you have somebody going and running claws, right? So I previously had claws on her, let's say. And as soon as, let's say, a new type of weapon is available, usually the AI will try it on you first as a little bit of a sort of, game design training method kind of thing. So suddenly somebody comes up to your wizard, punches them in the face, and it's like, hey, wait a minute, that didn't poison, that made their MP go away. What gives? And so you kill that guy, you steal his claw, and it's like, oh, MP reduction clause. Cool, that's pretty neat. You walk up to another guy, wow, that guy cannot hit absolutely anything with that claymore, but man, that's a high predicted damage number. I wonder if I could steal that and add it to, let's say, my warrior with his guaranteed hit skill. Oh wow, his damage went up at the cost of a ton of speed. Also, he can't hit anything normally, but as soon as he activates his skills, he's very accurate all of a sudden. Or let's say we have a type of axe, like side-graded axes down the line, can be modified to slow an enemy down when they hit them. There's a ridiculously eye-watering amount of numbers of effects like this. So please know that yeah, you'll usually get samples of this equipment before you have to go and buy it and equip it and modify it and whatever else. So don't worry about buying stuff too much, but you should pay attention to the shop. Because like right now, we're in the beginning of Chapter 1, and for example, many miss that you can get a Terror Knight at this point by going to the shop and buy a Dread Knight mark. Many miss that you can have a rogue by this point if they didn't get Sarah for whatever reason, or just ignored Sarah, in which you can just go to the river map and get rogue marks. If you have, let's say, a Beast Tamer, which you can get after doing this fight right up here, sorry, then immediately you can go into the lake here after you do the story battle, and you can recruit things like Cyclopes to your team. There's a lot of classes that you can get at the very beginning, including Nybeth, the Necromancer, right over here. Those rogues that I just mentioned have an ability to steal something, and you can go and steal a Necromancer mark from him, which allows you to have a Necromancer in the start of Chapter 1, which is one of the few ways that you can genuinely revive somebody in the middle of a fight at the cost of permanently turning them into a zombie. In Chapter 4, there are ways to potentially revert this, but if you need somebody better right here and now, technically speaking, you can zombify them, so that option is there. Alright, so let's talk about a few beginner builds here just to get you started. Now, I personally think this is a pretty fun build for Denim. Essentially, you have two weapons that use the same kind of dexterity score here if you happen to have a fast guy. Honestly, Denim, in most cases, it's recommended just to make him a knight and just go full defensive with him because you always want to keep him alive. But I personally like this juxtaposition between crossbow and dagger. It gives him a reason to carry two different finishers. Both of them benefit from trajectory. It's just a fun thing to experiment around with. Usually I would recommend switching Vice to a heavier weapon than his typical starting claw, because you can freely sacrifice him whenever you'd like. Kashua is perfectly fine as she is, you never have to touch her at all. For your starting warrior, again, they're fine as they are. If you did answer all of the questions negatively at the start, you'll actually have a female warrior here who actually brings in the wrong weapon for her weapon skills. Apparently Hamilton gets so offended in that scenario he sends you a broken soldier. But anyways, usually I like switching her over to Knight and just keeping Denim as warrior. But again, she'll have good physical stats, so just kind of do whatever you'd like with her. You'll get a second Knight in the form of Voltaire anyway. I personally like turning him into a Terror Knight, but again, you do you. He's very physically orientated. Your starting archer comes with trajectory, so you should use that as much as possible. In her case, it's relatively simple. You switch over to shortbow relatively quickly. It's the same power as your warbow at the cost of a little bit of range, but you can use a shield now. And then you just sort of pick whether you prefer shortbows, longbows, crossbows as you go along. Kind of experiment around with different ones before you're really committed to any weapon skills, and you'll generally find which ones you prefer. For the rogue, you can, again, do whatever you'd like. Personally, I'm just experimenting with making her a sort of fencer sort in this case. Actually, same thing with Felicia, which if you let Donalto die at the very beginning, you'll end up getting Felicia, who is an early game ninja dressed as a priest. It's just a little bit of a community meme here, but either way, a nice little sort of a speedy shutdown unit. They sort of run up, attack things, and put them to sleep with a sleep bomb. And a fun little unit to play around with. Usually most folks will wind up with Donalto, in which case you just have an extra healer. With your sorceress, I would recommend possibly giving them a second element, like just picking any other element. I was going to go ice on her, in order just to have additional spells available and kind of usable. So we'll just go ahead and give her some ice spells right here, give her some ice magic. I will go ahead and go up here. Now, the reason for this is because while the dark element does get more debuffs than everything else, one of the downsides is that it does not affect undead units, which you won't be fighting them all the time, but it is regular enough that you should probably avoid using it like permanently, you know? But one thing that is worth mentioning is that you should pick and augment whatever it is that you choose to augment. So in this case, I'm going to augment both ice and dark, and so every time that they use a dark spell, or an ice spell in this case, they will be training a little bit. Every time this ranks up, they get a bit more powerful with those abilities. This only affects damage, as well as improving your resistance against that particular element, or its opposing element, rather. It does not affect accuracy. Okay, next is going to be your monk. They're, once again, fine as they are. Spellbooks are a good little sort of ranged category that allows them to attack at awkward ranges, staying relatively safe, but you should pick up Augment Light at your soonest convenience. And additionally, as far as their abilities go, it is recommended to pick up their kind of class abilities as soon as you can. So Mother's Blessing doubles the effect of your healing, which is very, very potent. You don't actually get that many healing spells in this game, and this version anyway. So the way that One Vision handled it is that your basic healing spell can actually still be good into the post-game. But use things like Augment Light, a high mind score, and Mother's Blessing to multiply the ever-loving befuckery out of it. So right now we have those abilities. Later on we'll get Consecrate, which allows you to basically go up and consecrate an entire area, giving everyone Healcraft, which further modifies your spell even harder. I would recommend picking up Stun Ward on your healer, though, so that you aren't potentially running into that situation that they are stunned and fail to heal something. So the ward abilities we haven't covered yet. Basically, this makes you immune to a particular debuff and allows you to remove that debuff from somebody nearby. If you've played XCOM 2, it's kind of like the buddy abilities, but only for one debuff. For the Valkyrie, pick whatever weapon you'd like, but pick up Faded Circle immediately. That ability is incredibly useful. Actually, I failed to mention one thing earlier, which I will go do right now, which was actually over on the Rogue. So one of the things that you should use a Rogue for as well is actually for the opposite reason. I haven't trained this on her yet, but if you like your ranged attacks, Bullseye will give you the same ability, except it's for ranged attacks. So this allows your Rogue to function as a spotter for any nearby ranged units. Now, right now, they will be pretty accurate on your own, but let's say you have, I don't know, a soldier throwing javelins, or you have Canopus running around using throwing axes, or a necromancer with a poisonous crossbow or something, and they can't hit any dang thing. They suck at actually aiming. You give them Bullseye, they will hit their shots every time. So that's very useful to have, and always makes those debuffs land. For Canopus, I would recommend ignoring his starting skills, switching him over to hammers, using Huapunga Winds as soon as you can. This is his unique ability that allows him to dodge arrows particularly well as give himself regeneration. He is something of a dodge tank. And then pick up that fire spell that you got from your first tutorial fight, put on fire magic, and then from there use counter hit as your next ability to just gain a weapon skill a bit faster. trajectory certainly helps with all of this as well. But as soon as he hits rank 2 on hammers, he'll have access to Tyrant's Mace, which will end up getting its damage boosted by the Fireball spell. So just generally useful stuff to have. So anyways, that's about that. Remember your trajectory, remember to use Faded Circle and Bullseye and your recruit skills as best as you can. It is something that you generally want to do all the dang time. Again, recruiting is more than just collecting units to your side, and if you decide to just fire them on the spot, you've basically robbed them of all their equipment, which is way faster to do than it was in Final Fantasy Tactics. So I'm hoping this explained most of what you need to know to get started on this whole thing. If you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and leave a question. I'll get to it as soon as I can. And yeah, that's kind of about that. So y'all have yourselves a good one. Take care, and thank you so much for stopping by. All right, have some fun. Bye.